The wind was screaming across the mountains when Arlen Hayes saw the SUV flip once, twice, then vanish into a curtain of white so thick it looked as if the world itself had swallowed it whole. For a split second, he froze on the snowy trail, his breath sharp in his throat, the memory of another accident, the one that took his wife, flashing like lightning behind his eyes. But then instinct surged. He ran. He ran even though the blizzard was raging, even though his boots kept sinking into the powder, even though he had no guarantee anyone inside that SUV was still alive. He ran because he knew what it felt like to wait for help that never came, and he refused to let another human being die alone in the cold. If you believe kindness and second chances still matter in this world, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. It helps stories like these reach more hearts. Arlen reached the wrecked vehicle just as snow began to bury it. The windows were shattered, the doors warped from the impact, and the bitter daylight was fading under the choking clouds. He pulled at the door until it cracked open, and inside he found a woman, barely conscious, slumped over the steering wheel, her breath trembling in the frozen air. Her name, he would later learn, was Mara Lennox, the famously relentless CEO of Lennox Dynamics, a woman whose world operated in elevators, boardrooms, and billion-dollar negotiations, not icy mountain passes. Right now, though, she wasn't powerful. She wasn't polished. She was cold, shivering, and dangerously pale, her hair damp with melted snow and a fine cut bleeding along her temple. Arlen didn't waste a second. He lifted her carefully into his arms, feeling how light and fragile she seemed despite her reputation. Her lips moved faintly as though she wanted to protest, but no words came. The storm was worsening. He could barely see 3 feet ahead. He knew he couldn't get her down the trail safely. Not in this weather, not with her slipping toward hypothermia. So he headed toward the only shelter nearby, an old logging cabin, abandoned years ago but still standing, tucked behind a ring of frost-bitten pines. He had used it once while hiking with his 8-year-old son, Rowan, and he prayed it hadn't collapsed under winter's weight. By some miracle, the cabin was still there, its roof bowed but intact. He pushed inside, the rusty hinges protesting, and laid Mara down against a bundle of old quilts. There was no fireplace, only an old metal stove that smoked if you looked at it wrong, but he managed to coax a flame into life. The room slowly warmed, though the cold still clung to them like a second skin. Mara blinked awake in the thin afternoon light filtering through the frosted window. She looked disoriented, her breath shaking, her voice hoarse as she tried to make sense of where she was. Arlen offered her water and checked her pulse, relieved to find it steadying. She watched him, confused, vulnerable, yet trying to maintain some shard of composure. Her red dress, elegant and utterly impractical for a mountain road, was still damp at the hem. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hide the shivers, but he could see them anyway. Arlen draped the only thick blanket he found across her shoulders. It wasn't much, a rough wool piece that smelled faintly of dust and time, but she pulled it close as though it held the last heat in the world. As she thawed, her eyes softened, not polished, not calculating, not the eyes of a CEO used to commanding entire industries. These were simply human eyes, exhausted and scared. Afternoon became early evening, though the storm outside remained brutally bright, its light nearly colorless. Sometimes the world turned harshest in the day, not the night. Mara tried to sit up, but the cold had settled into her bones. She winced, her breath hitching. Arlen moved closer, concerned she might faint again. She looked at him, really looked at him this time, as though seeing beyond the flannel shirt, beyond the tired lines on his face, beyond the calloused hands that had saved her life. That was when she whispered it, barely audible over the wind rattling the cabin door. "Can I slip under your blanket?" Her voice didn't carry seduction. It carried fear, fragile need, human truth. Arlen hesitated, not because he doubted her intentions, but because he remembered the hospital, the cold sheets, and the moment he had held his wife's hand for the last time. He had sworn to keep people safe, not cross boundaries. But this wasn't a boundary. This was survival. Humans needed warmth. Hypothermia didn't care about corporate titles or tragic pasts. So he nodded gently, opened the blanket, and let her lean into him. Her shoulder trembled against his chest, and he could feel her slow, uneven breaths. The warmth between them grew slowly. First uncomfortable, then necessary, then strangely comforting. She smelled faintly of frost and expensive perfume, but underneath that, there was something unguarded, something raw. For the first time in a long time, Arlen felt another person rest against him, not out of desire or obligation, but trust. Mara didn't speak for a long time. Instead, she listened to the storm and the steady beat of his heart. When she finally did speak, her words spilled out quietly, as though she had been carrying them for years. She admitted she wasn't used to receiving kindness without a price. She confessed she hadn't taken a real day off in 8 years, not since her father died, and she inherited the company that slowly turned her into someone even she could barely recognize. She didn't cry, but emotion warred behind her eyes. Arlen didn't respond with grand speeches. He simply told her about Rowan, about the small life he built after everything fell apart, about how grief forced him to learn simplicity, humility, and the power of helping without expectations. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He didn't pretend to have a perfect life. He just spoke with quiet honesty. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something softened, something thawed between two people who had been freezing in their own very different ways. Hours passed. Daylight lingered strangely, like the storm had trapped time as well. Mara began to breathe more evenly, her body warming back to life. Her head eventually rested against his shoulder, her heartbeat slow and steady. He adjusted the blanket, making sure she stayed covered, and she murmured a soft thank you that felt like an exhale of her soul. When the blizzard finally eased into a bright, still afternoon, Arlen decided it was safe enough to try to signal for help. Using an emergency flare he always kept in his backpack, he stepped outside and fired it into the gray sky. The red streak cut through the cold like a promise. Within an hour, a rescue team spotted them. Mara was taken to a nearby medical station, and Arlen followed to make sure she was all right, though part of him believed he'd vanish from her high-status world the moment she stepped back into it. But he didn't vanish. She wouldn't let him. The next day, when the light was gentler and the world felt reborn after the storm, Mara sought him out. She looked different, still polished, but changed in a way she couldn't hide. She stood before him not as a CEO, but as a woman trying to understand a new version of herself. She thanked him, not just for saving her life, but for giving her something she hadn't felt in years, safety that came without conditions. Arlen didn't know what their futures held, but he did know that something real had formed in that cabin. Not romance, not promises, just truth. Truth and humanity. She asked if she could meet Rowan. He nodded, shyly grateful. Their worlds were different, but kindness, humility, and a near-death night had built a fragile bridge between them. And sometimes, that's all two broken human beings need. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Your support helps us keep telling stories that remind the world what compassion truly looks like. Special request. Comment below. Would you help a stranger in a storm?